Hey friends, real quick before today's stories, I just wanted to bring your attention to something. So, I recently had a channel synthetically replicating my voice via AI, creating narration content that actually got their channel over 1,000 subscribers. And the voice, honestly, was scarily accurate. But there is some good news, as for any up-and-coming and current narration channels. Google support referenced me to a privacy complaint form that you can submit, with them stating, if you found AI-generated or other synthetic content that uses your voice or image, you can request remove it through their privacy request process. So it's kind of like a privacy complaint, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm thankful that it exists. And thankfully, after I submitted that and kind of threw a tantrum on Twitter, the person that was stealing my voice has since taken down their videos. But I just wanted to let you guys know that this process exists, and that is an option for anybody in case any content creators or just yourself are experiencing inappropriate use of your likeness on YouTube's platform via AI, and especially as AI continues to get exponentially better. It really is scary at times, but anyways, I'll leave that Google support form linked down below in the description so you can use that as appropriately needed. But yeah, on to today's stories. With the real Let's Read. As all of you know, life can be a struggle sometimes. Making ends meet isn't always as easy as just getting a job. Several years back, I couldn't find a job. It was rejection after rejection. And at the time, nobody was really hiring, and the few places that were hiring were very ultra-competitive. I was barely making over minimum wage as a deli employee at a grocery store. I remember one night I was working online for ways to make extra money, and I ended up stumbling upon Craigslist. I'd heard of Craigslist, but never really explored it for myself. I found an ad on Craigslist for a freelance job where I would be what's called a secret shopper. For those of you who may not be familiar with what a secret shopper is, it's basically an anonymous customer who comes into a store and asks the employees a series of questions. The employee is then graded on certain criteria. For example, does the employee make eye contact, greet you, give a suggestion, offer to escort the customer, and give a parting comment, etc.? It seems simple, but a lot of companies, specifically the store I work for, will reprimand the employee for a bad secret shopper score and even fire the employee if they get more than one bad score. Since I had experience in a store and I know exactly what they're looking for, I thought that this would be an easy way to make some money on the side. The first store I visited was a local chain of grocery stores in my hometown. Oddly enough, it was the same company I worked for, but not the same store though. I started making my rounds and noticed a man, probably in his 20s, stocking the shelves. He looked at me and immediately put his head back down. He didn't greet me, so he got points off right away. I had to greet him and ask him where the canned tuna was. He never lifted his head from stocking the shelves and just sort of angrily said, "Aisle 2, halfway down." Again, this guy lost points for not making eye contact and offering to show me where it was located. Also, just for the record, I know how ridiculous all of this is, but these stupid companies take this junk so seriously. They don't care if you're waiting on another customer or what the excuse is. If you get a bad score, you're kind of screwed. I was trying to pause and give the guy a chance to redeem himself by telling me to have a good day, but he never did. And I eventually had to initiate the parting remark, and that's when he finally looked up and said, "Yeah, you too." And I finally saw his name tag and wrote down on it was a name, Patrick. And I smiled and walked away, and I noticed that Patrick kept his eye on me. I felt his stare as I walked away, and I started to figure that he was on to me, that I was maybe a secret shopper. I was going to ask a few more employees questions, but I started to feel uncomfortable. Every time I looked up, I could see this Patrick at the end of the aisles. It almost seemed like he was following me. I wasn't sure what the end game was for this guy, but I didn't want to find out. I cashed out, and the cashier passed her secret shop with flying colors, though. And after I cashed out, I briskly made my way to my car, and I just wanted to get out of the store so bad and be done with this. Once I was in the car, I started writing down the full report before I drove off. I just wanted to get all the information down while it was still fresh. But while I was writing, I looked up and saw my buddy from the aisle intensely walking through the parking lot, Patrick. I ducked down a little bit, but thankfully it didn't appear like he had noticed me. He just kept walking until he got to his car, which was a dark four-door sedan of some kind, and he sped off, and I waited a few minutes before I departed. I don't know why, but this guy just gave me the creeps, though. I kept thinking to myself, why was he following me around the store like that? If he really was, but it truly did feel like he was, and it just felt so weird. I'm a textbook overthinker, so I tried telling myself that maybe I was overthinking, but something about him was just definitely off. That night, I went home and I emailed my supervisor the report, and life went on. It only took a day or two for me to completely forget about that interaction. A few nights after I turned in the report, I was having a late-night dinner with my boyfriend. We were just hanging out, enjoying each other's company. The relaxing evening was interrupted by a loud and consistent banging on the front door. It wasn't just an aggressive knock either. It was like the sound of someone throwing their entire body weight at the door. You have no idea how horrifying it is to hear a knock at the door at that hour, let alone a banging knock like this one. We looked out the window, and I was at a loss for words. It was that Patrick guy from the grocery store, and he looked horrible. His eyes looked like they were sunken in, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. I called out, telling him to leave right now, that I was calling the police, and he didn't even flinch. He just kept banging and demanding that I let him enter the home. Repeatedly, he kept saying that I ruined his life, and that I needed to pay. That there would be an eye for an eye, I remember him saying. I didn't even want to think about what he meant by that. While this interaction was happening, my boyfriend had called the police, though. They must have been in the area because the first squad car showed up in less than 2 minutes, and it's a good thing, too, because I don't know how much longer my door was going to hold up. Patrick was really throwing himself into the door, and this whole sight was nuts. A cop tackled Patrick right on my front steps and handcuffed him, and while they were apprehending him, they ended up finding a knife concealed in his waistband, which for me was the most terrifying information about this entire ordeal. I still can't stop thinking about what he intended to do with that knife if he had broken down the door. After he was arrested, I did get some closure on this whole nightmare. It turns out it was just a situation of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Apparently, Patrick was at the end of the cliff, and my visit to the store that day was what forced him to fall completely off. He was struggling to pay his bills, and from what I was told, his girlfriend had just broken up with him the day of that secret shopping event. And when I approached him in the store that day, he was only minutes away from the end of his shift and was just mentally completely done at that point. I get it. We've all been there. Well, to a degree. And I happened to catch him on a bad day, and asking for a can of tuna was the last thing on his mind. He ended up losing his job because he had failed another secret shopper report, a report that I sent in. The part that I can't still figure out about this is I have no idea how he found out where I lived. I don't think he followed me that day after the store, but there's no other way that he would know where I lived. I stayed at my boyfriend's house after that night, and I rarely stayed at my old house alone. I don't know what happened to this guy, but I genuinely hope that he figured it out, and more importantly, I hope these stores get rid of the secret shopper program because it's just horrible. Not long ago, I decided to listen to a friend of mine about picking up some babysitting jobs from Craigslist. I know that seems weird, but I was surprised at how many postings for that type of work were on there. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have needed the job, but at the time, I had just broken up with my boyfriend, and I didn't think that I was going to be able to pay my rent. This seemed like the easiest way to make some money. It helps that I used to babysit when I was a teenager, and my brother has 2 small kids, so I felt like an expert in the field. After all, how hard could looking after some children for a few hours be? I set up a job for early Saturday evening, and I started messaging a woman named Chloe. The woman said that her and her husband would be leaving the house at around 5:15 p.m. and they would be back sometime after 10. She gave me the address and all the information about the children. I would be watching 2 boys, and one of the boys was 7 and the other was 9. I was figuring that this was going to be easy money. In my opinion, boys that age are easy to entertain, and because they weren't babies, they wouldn't need my undivided attention. After I talked to the lady, I told my friend about the job, who was jealous of the money that I was about to make. She had been doing the Craigslist babysitting jobs for a few months now and had never come close to the money I was about to make, or at least told that I was about to make. On Saturday evening, I made my way to the address given to me by Chloe, and right away, I had some regrets. The house was in a very sketchy neighborhood. Not necessarily crime-ridden, but it was a poor and run-down area. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I waited for several minutes and attempted several more knocks on the door when, finally, a strange and very rough-looking man answered the door. He was tall and skinny with this massive gray beard. I would say that he was at least in his 50s, unless he just looked rough for his age. And in this very low and gruff voice, he said, "Come on in, sweetheart. Sorry I didn't hear the knocks. My ears ain't what they used to be." I walked inside, and the first thing I noticed was how not child-friendly the house was. A lot of trash and just general clutter was lying about, and I was just standing in the front of the door, and the man then says, "My wife should be back any minute with the kids. Go and sit down and make yourself at home. Sorry, I know the place ain't the cleanest." I was trying not to be judgmental. I know it sounds like I should be running for the hills, but I didn't want to unfairly judge this guy or his family. And the man pointed down the hall and told me that the living room was in the back of the house. I made my way back there and sat on this bluish couch. The amount of anxiety I felt at this moment was absolutely crushing, though. I saw no pictures of children, no toys, and no indication whatsoever that children even lived there. While I was waiting on the couch, I could hear the man walking back and forth in the other room, and I think he was mumbling to himself. Every few minutes he would begin to shout, "Hey, sorry about this, ma'am. My wife can be forgetful with the time. I promise she'll be back soon." A few minutes later, he ran into the room scratching his head. With this big smile, he said, "You know what? I'm an idiot. I bet my wife came inside with the kids through the basement entrance. She's probably waiting for you down there. Nobody uses the front door that you came in. The basement's right over there. Why don't you go check it out, and I'll meet you all down there in a minute." He stood there like some scarecrow, pointing to a door on the far side of the room. I didn't know what to do and just nodded and told him I would go check, and truthfully, I had enough at this point, though. He smiled and in this very unsettling voice says, "Oh, that's great. I'll see you in a second, sweetie." And then he walked back into the front door. I opened the door to the basement out of curiosity, and it was obvious that nobody was down there. The lights were off, and the smell was just horrific when it hit my nose. There was no chance I was going to go down there. And while staring into the dark basement, I heard that he was still bumping around in the front room, and without thinking, I ran as fast as I could toward the front door that I came from. Once I hit it, the door was locked. I quickly unlocked it and ran for my car. As I opened the car door, I could hear him yelling from inside the house, but I didn't look back. I started backing down the driveway, and I could see him running out of the house, waving his hands back and forth. And thankfully, by the time he reached the driveway, I was already flying down the road. I almost didn't call the police because technically I was physically fine and maybe even overreacting. But after calling my friend, she convinced me to call the authorities just in case. After the phone call, I had no idea what had happened. The dispatcher on the phone told me that they would take it from here and that was the end of it, at least on my end. Maybe there was a wife and kids. Maybe this was just a poor family that I just very unfairly judged. Maybe there really was an entrance to the basement that his wife used instead of that front door. But honestly, I'd rather look like some crazy jerk who judged the family than potentially be the victim of something very much worse. The unnerving nature of the situation told me to run, and I stand by that gut feeling. That very well could have been the best decision of my life. I'm sure we've all made some stupid mistakes when we were in high school. Sometimes it's not even you who makes the mistake, but just by joining in with your peers, you can find yourself in a very bad situation. When I was in high school, my friends and I would visit Craigslist and just roast all the weirdos we would find. Trust me when I say there is a lot of weirdos on Craigslist. One night, my friend group let things go a little too far, though. We found an ad from a guy who was looking for a woman to come over and massage his feet. Yeah, some weird stuff right out the gate there. And we all pretended to be the woman named Molly, and we started messaging this guy from a fake email account that we created. This was before the whole catfish phenomenon was talked about, but we were basically doing that same thing. It just didn't have a mainstream name yet. Even though this guy was a creep, we were still in the wrong for leading him on and pretending to be something we were not. My friend Dan was pushing the envelope, though. He was flirting and saying some things that he should not have been saying, and it was only a matter of time before this man sent us his address. Everyone started laughing, and I also laughed, really not finding it that funny, finding it very weird, but I did just want to fit in. But I just wanted this practical joke to end, to be honest, and I hoped we could arrive at that. Dan wasn't ready to let the joke end just yet. He wanted to visit the creep's house and actually try and get a glimpse of the man. I very much voted against this, but Dan peer pressured the group, and before I even knew it, we were in the car and on the way to this weirdo's house. The car ride was mostly quiet, other than Dan trying to get us fired up for the occasion. It took us about 15 minutes to get to the neighborhood of the man looking for his foot therapy, as he put it. And it was a pretty rough part of town, I remember. Definitely the area you don't want to be wandering around in after dark. It was clear that everyone was now regretting this decision except for Dan. We all thought that we were just going to drive by the house and then head back, but he had other plans. We stopped in front of the house, and while we were stopped, Dan opened the door and started making his way to that guy's front door. And we all started freaking out, trying to get him to come back into the car. Everyone except my friend who was driving got out of the car and tried pleading with Dan, and I remember even forcibly trying to hold Dan back, but he just started pushing through. We were arguing, really whisper arguing, trying to not bring attention to ourselves, and Dan looked at us, and I remember him saying, "Listen guys, I need to see what this freak looks like. I promise, once I get a quick glimpse, I'll just leave. What's the worst that can happen?" I was still against the idea, but I could tell that he won my friends over saying this, and not wanting to be the coward that I always was, I joined in as we snuck toward the house. I thought maybe Dan would peer through the window or something weird like that, but this absolute maniac went right to the front door. He really was a loose cannon back in those days. And without giving us any notice or any time to prepare or hide, he rang the doorbell. I remember my heart was beating so fast I was convinced that I was going to have a heart attack. Seconds later, this very short, but very overweight man wearing a bathrobe answered the door. And we all froze. And in a squeaky and, I admit, pretty comical voice, this guy says, "What's the meaning of this? Where's Molly?" Dan made some very inappropriate joke or comment and then proceeded to call the man a freak. And we all just started laughing and just briskly walking to the car. I was incredibly anxious, but I was trying to fit in, hence why I was laughing with the group, and we couldn't have been more than 10 feet away from the front of the house when this creepy man grabbed a rifle that he must have had right next to the door, and he was pointing it in our direction. His face was all red and he looked like he was shaking, and at that moment, we were all freaking out. Finally, Dan realized that we may have crossed a line there, obviously. The creepy man did say something, but through all the paranoia, None of us could hear what he said. We all ran as fast as we could, dove into the car. And I looked behind me as I closed the car door, and I could see the man starting to give chase with that rifle, still aiming it in our direction. We drove off as fast as we could, and when I looked behind me, he was now standing in the middle of the road, still staring down that barrel of the rifle. I ducked down, expecting to hear the rear window glass shatter at any second, but thank God it never did. We eventually made it back to the house, and we panicked for the entire night. We actually ended up receiving an email from him not long after we got home that said, "I will find you. I saw your car and your license plate. I will find where you live." And at that moment, we were beside ourselves. We didn't know what to do. We turned off all the lights, and I'm not kidding, we stared out that window the entire night, holding our breath every time a car would drive by. I remember I suggested maybe calling the police, but my friends talked me out of it. They made me believe that we were the ones who would get in trouble if we called them, so we didn't. And that was the longest night of my entire life. The creep never showed up, though, and we never heard from him again. I tried convincing myself that his threat was just some bluff, but I still never felt safe. It took months of not hearing from him for me to finally feel like I was safe. All these years later, I still haven't been down that street since that night. And even though I'm older, I still have an irrational fear that he'll be outside, waiting for me. And for that reason, I'll continue to avoid that area of town as long as I can. I want to acknowledge right from the start that I realize how dangerous a place like Craigslist can truly be. Even though there are tons of genuine and legitimate postings, I understand that it's still a hotbed of dangerous and horrible humans. I learned this for myself 10 years ago. Even back then, I knew that it wasn't the best place in the world, but I ignored all the horror stories because honestly, I was having some pretty good luck on Craigslist. I was making a ton of money doing side jobs from random postings. I've done everything from pet sitting to picking up a pizza and delivering it to someone's house. My friends at the time called me crazy for doing all these side jobs, but I was addicted to the hustle, I guess I could say. I was bringing home more money than most of my friends, and often the work was pretty easy. I continued answering the weird ads for several months. I even had my own special vetting process for identifying when postings weren't legitimate. I got myself a cheap track phone that I had used just in case I did deal with some kind of freak, and that way they wouldn't have my real number. Like all good things though, this hustle eventually came to an end, and one day I answered a posting that scared me a little too much. Right from the beginning, I should have ignored the posting, and it said something along the lines of, "A secretive gig for big cash." I don't remember exactly what the wording was, but I do remember that it specifically said big cash. And this kind of weird wording is usually some creep on the internet looking for something dirty, if you catch my drift. But like I said, I had a vetting process, so I wasn't going to pass up the chance for this big cash just in case this was legitimate. I clicked the posting, and of course, it was incredibly vague. I got in touch with the person who posted the job with my track phone, and I was surprised that a nice woman answered the phone. She was so nice and pleasant and introduced herself as I remember being Lydia. She explained to me what the job was and explained why the posting was so vague. She made the posting for her elderly grandfather, and he wanted to maintain his privacy. He wanted someone to come over to his house and clean his guns. I told her that I didn't have a clue how to do something like that, but she told me that he would be watching over me, making sure that I do everything the correct way. She told me that she didn't include that information in the ad because she didn't know if it was technically illegal to post about guns on Craigslist. I also just want to say that for any gun people out there that may be losing their minds, remember, I didn't know anything about guns at the time, and I really still don't. I didn't know if you needed any sort of training to clean a gun, and I just assumed since the owner would be there, I'd be fine. So we agreed on the money and went to meet, and then Lydia gave me the address. The day came and I made the drive to the address given. It was only about 20 minutes from my house, but it was still in a very secluded area. The house seemed to be old and beat up, and I knocked on the door, and an attractive woman answered. I pegged her to be in her early 20s, and she introduced herself as being Lydia, and I could tell right away from her voice that it was the woman that I spoke to on the phone. And just like on the phone, she was very pleasant. She guided me through the house, and it was honestly a very beautiful home. All throughout the house, it had that old-school wood finish. It almost looked like a cabin on the inside. As we're walking through the kitchen, Lydia told me that I could just throw my stuff on the counter and that she would take me to her grandfather. Because she was so bubbly and very chipper, I felt very comfortable and at ease. And without even thinking, I threw my purse right on the counter and continued to follow her down the hall. In the back of the house was a small room filled with all sorts of amazing war memorabilia. It was clear that this guy was a very decorated veteran. While I was looking at all the awards that this man had, I heard a loud slam behind me. Lydia slammed the door to the small room and stood in front of the doorway. Next to her was a taller man, and unlike Lydia, he was not good looking. His face was dirty and his hair had that perpetual wet look, even though it clearly was not wet. I would have to say that it was most likely in his early 20s as well. And realizing that the situation I was in was not good, I just put my hands up in defense. It didn't matter though. Lydia charged at me, threw me to the wooden floor, and I could see the long legs of the man still standing in the doorway as I laid on the floor. Lydia began kicking me in the ribs. I remember wanting to fight back, but my body just wouldn't move. Finally, the kicking stopped, and I could feel Lydia's face get close to mine, and she whispered something like, "If you even try to get up, my boyfriend will put you down for good." I stayed on the floor and listened as this Lydia and the tall man left the room. They scurried around the house a little bit, and then after a few minutes I heard 2 car doors shut. Apparently they had peeled away. And figuring that it was that Lydia and her boyfriend who left, I tried to get off the ground and made my way to the kitchen. My purse that I set on the counter was now gone, and that's where I had my phone and my keys. I looked out the window, and I saw that my car was also gone. The car that drove out of here was my car, and I was freaking out on the inside, but I was trying to keep very level-headed on the outside. I started walking down the road until I reached an old man actually selling vegetables from a farm stand outside of his house. The man could not have been more of a sweetheart, though. He gave me some food and water, and we called the police, and I reported everything with as much detail as I could. The police found my car about 20 miles away from where all this took place. All the windows were broken out, and the inside of the vehicle was completely slashed and destroyed. Thankfully, my purse was left behind with my ID, but all the money had been stolen, which really wasn't a lot. And as it turns out, I got lucky with the police being able to actually solve this case. Lydia did a great job covering her tracks on Craigslist and making it seem like she was just a shadow. But fortunately for me, she was also a complete idiot. She lured me to her actual grandfather's house. He was living in Florida for the season, so the house was vacant at that time. Lydia and her boyfriend robbed the house, and they intended to lure someone to the house and steal their car. Why they ditched the car so close to the house, I still don't understand. And they ended up finding this Lydia in a motel about an hour away from home. She was alone, and from what I understand, she never told the cops who this man was or where he went. In case it wasn't obvious, this was the last job I ever took on Craigslist, and I advise anyone reading this, please be careful. I used to be that guy that would do anything just for $1. Well, actually, I still am that guy. I'm also someone who is lucky enough to be able to fix just about anything. I'm what you might refer to as a handyman of sorts, and so anytime I could pick up some side work for cash, I was totally in. I'm not really sure exactly how long ago this happened, but I was in my early 20s for sure. I'm 33 now for a point of reference, and at the time I was struggling a little bit to make ends meet. My girlfriend at the time told me about Craigslist and about how there is a chance to make some money there. I'd heard about Craigslist but never really gave it a shot. I didn't know that there was work posted there, though. Once I started exploring Craigslist, I found a lot of job offers. People looking for painting, yard work, and even plumbing. I was weighing my options and trying to find the best posting for me, and I ended up answering this post from a guy named Steve. He was really weird. Just my straight-up first impression of the guy was not great. He was middle-aged, short, and a little round. He had these huge eyes that bulged out of his head, and he was rocking that sort of horseshoe haircut. You know the one, bald on the top and hair on the sides. But weird appearances aside, he was going to pay me some pretty good money to basically build him a little room in his basement. Specifically, he wanted to finish a small chunk of his basement and make it a sort of man cave. We set up times where I could go and work for several hours at a time, and he would pay me after each session. The house itself was weird. It was a big house in a nice neighborhood, but the inside of the house was kind of gross and basically empty. It looked like a frat house, even though the guy was middle-aged, and in the basement, Steve had already bought a ton of supplies. Everything I needed for the job and then some, and he explained in detail exactly how he wanted everything. This guy had intricate blueprints and everything, and I made sure that I constantly checked with him before I did any more work, just because I wanted to make sure that we were always on the same page. Other than being weird, Steve wasn't a bad guy. We talked about the project a little bit, and then he disappeared, and I wouldn't see him again until I left. After the first session, I started bringing my brother with me from time to time. The job was more ambitious than I had intended. Whenever my brother came with me, Steve would never come into the basement. I'd only see him when I was alone. For the next few weeks, we worked on the basement whenever we could find the time. We thought it was weird that Steve only wanted to finish a small portion of the basement and not the whole room. He clearly had more than enough supplies, so it just seemed weird to want to renovate a small little room. My brother and I would constantly talk about how he would ever even turn this into a man cave. It was going to be so small that you would barely be able to fit a love seat in the room. But ultimately, the conversation always led to us not caring because we were getting paid. One late afternoon while we were there, I was finishing putting up a door for the small room, and I was proud of the little room that I had built, and the door was nearing the finishing touches. My brother was out in the truck just grabbing some tools and probably having a cigarette. Steve must have thought that I was alone because he joined me in the basement. He looked eager and excited as I was finishing putting up the door. I made some comments about the door being ready, and without notice, Steve kicked me in the knee and pushed me into the room, slamming the door behind me. While I was getting to my feet, I could hear him putting some type of lock on the door, and I was more confused at this point, trying to process what was happening. I tried opening the door, but just as I expected, Steve had locked it somehow. And I remember he starts yelling something like, "You're mine now. You're staying here and you're not leaving." He just kept repeating versions of that same sentence repeatedly. I tried banging on the door, but it wasn't doing anything. I tried pleading with the guy, but he just kept screaming at me. After only a few minutes of this nonsense, I heard a loud thud, loud enough that I could feel the vibration through the door. In my confusion and panic state, I had totally forgot that my brother was still outside. He started making his way downstairs and witnessed everything that had just happened. And my brother wasted no time and hit Steve in the head with a wrench, and that apparently was the loud thud that I had heard seconds prior. While Steve was unconscious on the ground, my brother was able to find the key to the padlock in his pocket and also found 2 different pocket knives on his belt. My brother got me out of that room and we immediately called the police. While we were waiting, my brother pretty much stood over Steve and made sure that he stayed unconscious. When the police finally showed up, Steve was arrested for attempting to keep me as a prisoner, or something like that. I'm so thankful that my brother was there that day, though. I still get freaked out thinking about this Steve character, and whatever his intentions he had that day. If my brother wasn't there, who knows how long I could have been stuck there. I'm not sure what happened to Steve, though. After this ordeal, I tried to move on and forget about it, and this is the first time I'm even revisiting this memory since it happened. It was probably the stupidest thing that guy could have done, but also the scariest. Back in the mid-2010s, I had some pretty good luck doing odd jobs on Craigslist. They were mostly landscaping jobs that paid decently most of the time, and my full-time gig allowed me a lot of free time, so this was a great way for me to make some side money and also be outside. On a Monday, I answered an ad for a landscaping job on a Friday. I started communicating with a woman, and we eventually exchanged numbers, and the way she was texting seemed almost flirtatious. Her name was Tracy, and after she told me about the job, she continued texting me, asking very probing questions like, "How big are your muscles? I hope you're able to lift all this mulch." And she would accompany all these messages with some smiling emojis. At the time, being a single guy in my early 20s, I loved the attention. I have to say I'm not the best at picking up the signs though, but I felt like it was obvious at this point that she was flirting with me. I started to roll the dice more with my messages back, and I tried to see how far I could take the conversation without going over the line. It was becoming clear to me that there was no line though. We texted that entire night and continued texting throughout the entire week. It was crazy, I admit that, but the weirdness of the situation was kinda hot for me. But in the middle of the week, the flirting evolved into something much more personal. She started sending me pictures of her posing in the kitchen and doing that duck face. I don't even know if girls still do that, but back then, all the girls did the duck face. We started sharing details about herself, and she told me that she was divorced and now single. She said that she was 37 years old, and I loved the idea of talking to an older woman, just as she admitted that she loved talking to a younger guy. We texted nonstop for days, and we even made a plan for Friday night after the landscaping job. She told me that I could shower at her place, and let's just say that she implied much, much more. I'd never been more excited to do a landscaping job in my life, to be honest. On Friday morning, the day of the job, she texted me and said that she would be at work when I got there, but everything I would need was in the backyard in the shed. After that text, I never got another message from her for the entire day, which was kind of weird. And I'm not kidding when I tell you that I messaged this girl all day, every day since Monday, so not hearing from her was kind of strange. I messaged her a few times just to see how she was doing and see if we were still hanging out after the job, but like I said, no answer. All day long, I couldn't shake the thought that I had been catfished all week. Some creep was probably messaging me pretending to be a woman. And by 4 in the afternoon, I was just about done with the job, and since I hadn't heard from Tracy, I had given up hope that she was even a real person. Not 5 minutes later, I felt a jolt of excitement as I saw a green sedan pull into the driveway, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Tracy, the same woman from all the pictures on my phone. I smiled, but she didn't even look at me and just parked and walked inside the house. I started walking to the house, and then this big white truck pulled in behind Tracy's car. The driver got out aggressively and stormed into the house. He was a huge man, like very muscular huge, and he looked almost like a professional wrestler or even like a pro football player. He was bald, but he had that sort of clean bald look. I had no idea what was happening, but no matter what, I had to go inside so I could get paid for all this work. The front door was open, and only the screen door was shut. I sort of shouted through the screen that I was finished with the work and that I was coming inside to meet Tracy for the payment. I entered the screen, and as I walked a few feet into the house, the large man moved in behind me, standing in front of the screen door. Tracy emerged from the room in front of me, and in a very hysterical voice, she shouted, "That's the guy, babe. That's the creep from Craigslist who won't stop texting me." This giant man started stepping to me and cussing me out for hitting on his wife. I immediately went into self-defense mode and shouted, "Whoa, man, she told me she was single. I got the messages to prove it." The guy paused for a second, looking at me, and I could hear Tracy shouting "liar" behind me. And while she was screaming, the man started to get hot, and he started screaming at her. And before I knew it, I was in the middle of an argument that I didn't want to be in. Tracy continued to call me a liar among many other things, and at the same time was yelling at the large man. Tracy's husband effortlessly pushed me out of the way and aggressively made his way towards her. When he was just inches away, she pulled out from behind her back one of those sort of meat tenderizers, I think it was. It was almost like a spiked mallet thing that some people might have in their kitchen, and she strikes him in the head. And it must have been a pretty good shot because he fell over instantly. He tried to get up, but couldn't get up off his knees. He just stood there, clutching his head in pain. I kept shouting, asking if he was okay, but he wasn't saying anything. I was so confused. And I looked up, and now Tracy started running at me with that mallet in her hand. And without thinking, I just kicked at her towards her ankle or something and causing her to fall on her face. And while both these freaking psychos are on the ground, I ran out of the house. And once I drove off, I called the police, telling them everything that had happened. And from what I know, they did arrest Tracy that evening, but I don't think the husband pressed charges though. That man, who was no saint I might add, eventually paid me for the work that I did, and in hindsight I just think I was an innocent victim of a very toxic relationship that hit a very strong boiling point. In many ways it's a good thing that I was there and called the police when I did, because if I didn't, who knows what Tracy or her husband could have done to one another, or worse, what they could have done to somebody else if they answered that ad instead of me. I really want to share one of the weirdest experiences in my life. It's something that isn't directly scary on the surface, but when you stop and think about it, it's truly unsettling. This took place before Instacart was a thing, and one day I happened to stumble on this Craigslist posting for a gopher. Essentially, it's the same thing as Instacart. It was an old man who wanted someone to take his list and go grocery shopping for him since he didn't move around very well anymore. I thought it was probably a scam, but I checked it out anyways, and I was surprised that the job was legit. I did this for a few months, if not a year, and it was a simple gig that virtually didn't take me very long. Once a week I would drive to the old man's house and grab his list and cash, and without knowing anything about me, this old guy would hand me cash every week and trusted that I would return with what he wanted. Lucky for him, I'm a trustworthy guy, so I would grab his groceries, and then he would pay me $200 when I would return. And this was the easiest money I had ever made in my entire life. One spring day, I showed up to the man's house on Tuesday afternoon, just like I did every single week. The man seemed tense though, more so than usual. He was always a little grumpy and strange, but not tense and paranoid. On this day though, he kept looking out the windows and was frantically pacing around the house with his cane. I kept asking him if he was all right, and he would just tell me to shut up and mind my own business. I swear I could hear him saying stuff under his breath like, they're coming. But I'm honestly not 100% sure if that's what he was saying, and it got to the point where I was practically begging him to give me the list so I could grab his groceries, but he just seemed too distracted. After about 5 minutes of watching this man pace around like Yoda, he finally shouted for me to come into the kitchen. All of a sudden, his demeanor was completely changed. He looked sad, almost regretful. In a very soft voice, he said to me, "You've been good and patient helper over these last months. When you come back, I'm going to give you a bonus. You've become my best friend, kiddo." It actually made me a little sad to hear something like that. After dealing with this guy as long as I did, it was clear that he didn't have any family or friends. But I soon forgot about that sadness when I started thinking about the bonus that he mentioned. I thanked him, grabbed the list, and made my way to the door. And just as I was about to leave, the man shouted for me to wait. I turned around, and as he limped down the hall, he extended his hand for a handshake. I smiled, shook his hand, and then left. The entire time I was at the store, I kept trying to figure out what was going on with the old guy. He clearly wasn't himself, and his affectionate actions towards me were pretty out of character for this grumpy old guy. I spent about 30 minutes at the store, and as I was turning onto the street where the old man lived, I was stopped by the police telling me that the road was closed off. I looked up, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There were at least 10 cop cars outside the old man's house. I was hoping that maybe they were at another house, but the more I examined the scene, I could see that some of the cars were in the driveway of the old man. I tried asking the police what was happening, and they ignored me for the most part. I pulled over and stood at the police barricade trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on. While I was standing there, 2 cops were escorting the old man out of the house in handcuffs and putting him in the back of a squad car. I started to get more erratic and told the cops that I was working for that old man and that I needed to know what was going on. Instead of giving me any information, the police were more concerned with how I knew the old man. And after some back and forth, I got nowhere with the police, and to this day I still have no idea what the man did. When I looked up his name, nothing comes up, so clearly the old man had given me a fake name or something like that. But what's really frustrating about this is that this is one of those cases that had virtually no coverage in my hometown. With all the excitement with gangs and things like that, some old man getting arrested really wasn't much news. I was telling a friend of mine this story recently, and he told me that I could schedule a meeting with the police to find out who he was and what he did. I guess technically they have to give me that information, but honestly I don't even know if that's true. I'm just going by what my friend told me. And at the time of me writing this, though, I haven't followed through and found out what he did. And since then, I've tried to think back to those visits to his house and try to think about anything in the house that could have given me a clue. The house was plain for the most part. There wasn't a lot of clutter, and it was mostly neat other than an old man's smell, I guess. And this is horrible to say, but I'm sure the old man is dead by now. What do you think he did? Am I just super overthinking this? And even though nothing directly happened to me here, I still think about it to this day, and I don't think I'll ever forget the image of that man being brought outside in handcuffs. I got my first job when I was 15. Back then, we barely made anything per hour. I honestly think I started at like $5 or something like that. I was working in customer service, which seemed like it would be relatively easy, but I knew instantly that I hated it. The customers were always rude and miserable to deal with most of the time. I did like getting a paycheck though, and it allowed me to get a cell phone and just have some toss around cash when hanging out with my friends. This was in the early days of things like Craigslist and Facebook, just as MySpace was winding down. Trying to find a better way to make some cash, I started strolling Craigslist for opportunities where I didn't have to deal directly with customers. It was pretty slim pickings. I called for a few landscaping jobs but never heard back. I stumbled across an ad looking for someone who could help with a summer cleanup of a few properties that were purchased adjacent to my neighborhood. The ad was pretty vague, I guess, and didn't mention much of that work actually needing to be done. I sent a response, and the next morning I got a call asking if I could show up to work. I was ecstatic. I figured if this worked out, I could kiss customer service goodbye, at least for the summer. I arrived at a property that was a little overgrown and a little shady from all the trees. I walked to a door that I assumed was a front door and was eventually greeted by this guy who introduced himself as Chip, and he had a smile almost like the Grinch. Crooked yellow teeth and absolutely rancid breath. It was honestly one of the worst things I'd ever smelled, and I can still see a smile in my mind to this day. Anyways, this guy, Chip, started giving me a tour of the grounds and outlined some of the work that needed to be done. Some outdoor maintenance, tree trimming, chopping wood, but wanted me to start with some interior cleaning. I remember him taking me down a narrow flight of stairs into a finished basement. It was one room and completely square. The ceiling, floor, and walls were all wood. It was extremely dim and only gave off a small amount of yellow light. He gave me Pledge or Pine Sol, I don't remember which one, but I remember I wasn't familiar with the product as it had a very strong smell, and I thought after attempting to clean the walls that I was either staining them or ruining them with how I was attempting to clean. I had chores all my life, so I wasn't a novice to cleaning, but it definitely wasn't the spray stuff my mom had for us at home to clean the woodwork. After about what I think was 2 hours of cleaning, I took a quick seat to wipe the sweat from my head and take a sip of water. As I sat on the floor, I looked up the stairway that was barely illuminated and thought that I saw a dog or something laying at the top of the stairs. I wiped off my glasses and squinted up the stairs to see if I could make out what it was, but I just couldn't. I slowly got up and walked closer and saw that it was that Chip guy lying on the floor with a seemingly blank expression. As I got closer, I called out, "Is that you?" The blank stare turned into this very grotesque smile with those yellow crooked teeth, and he then whispered something like, "Oops, you caught me," followed by a quiet little laugh. I decided to do some of the outdoor work to pass the time and everything was going fine, but I kept getting a weird feeling from recalling that very strange moment. Yes, it was extremely weird and I probably should have just gotten out of there then, but I was a teenage kid at the time, and I was a big kid, so I really didn't have too many worries, and I just wanted to make some money. While I was outside, this Chip guy would be out there having a cigarette, staring at me. Or if he wasn't outside, every so often I would look at one of the windows and the blinds would suddenly be moving. I started to pretend like I was looking the other way, but had my eyes fixated on the window. I could see his head trying to poke through the curtains looking at me and what I was doing. The day was about half over, give or take, if I recall correctly, and he asked if I could clean another basement similar to the one I had done before. I really didn't want to because I was freaked out from the last time, and because I felt like I was destroying this guy's damn wooden walls and floors with that pine saw. But I followed him to where I needed to go anyway, and as we got to the staircase, he stepped to the side and said something like, "There you go." But the basement was completely pitch black. I could barely see the stairs that I'd be walking down. I asked him, "Is there some light or something? I can't see." And he says, "Unfortunately not." And then went on to say that he had someone coming to install one, but there would be a light when I got down there. To this day, I still feel like he was breathing extremely heavily. I don't know if it was the hot breath hitting my neck and cheek, or if he was really breathing like Darth Vader. I took a few steps towards the stairs and felt his breathing stop, like he was getting excited or nervous. I quickly grabbed my phone like I was getting a call and took a few steps back and headed towards the door to go outside. I sort of did a mock phone call as Chip stared at me with his hands on his hips. I looked at him and said, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I got a family emergency and I gotta go." Given it was my first day, he was really understanding. He was passive-aggressive and kind of short, but he probably had the right to be. I knew right at that moment that there was no chance in hell that I was going back, though. I went back to my customer service job where, even though I had to deal with people's crap, it was pretty easy work. And about halfway through the summer, I was eating dinner in the living room after getting out of work while my parents were watching the news, and I heard a report about a stalking incident which also led to an attempted breaking and entering. I hated the news and thought nothing of it, but then I heard the anchor mention a name, and it was that guy Chip's name. I immediately threw my plate down, asked them to turn it up, and sure enough, there he was. It was his complete full name, and I could not believe it. My parents asked why I was all of a sudden interested in the news, and I just gave them some stupid answers so I didn't make them worried. But to this day, I wonder what would have happened if I continued working with this Chip guy. He was clearly some type of predator with pending charges of stalking and B&E. But anyways, now I work from home and don't have to deal with customers or any bosses that creep me out the way that guy did. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 7 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, or send it over email, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, kids, Joel reads so that you can sniff butts.